Hi. I just wanted to let you know at the top of the episode that our discussion today is going to be extremely critical of secular Buddhism.
We use some strong words in these criticisms. Condescending, insulting, reckless. We want to make it clear that we're aiming those words at secular Buddhism, not secular Buddhists.
We have very strong opinions that are critical of the movement and of the principles and origins of the movement itself, but we have no ill will or bad blood with any secular Buddhists themselves. Thank you. Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, is it possible to understand the Buddha as nothing more than a remarkable man with evidence-based insights and a strong message of compassion?
On the one hand, yes. He is nothing more than a remarkable man, in that his Buddhahood is available and attainable to us all. On the other hand, he is no regular everyday man. He possesses unique supernatural powers, previously unheard of knowledge, and powerful insights into the true nature of reality that separate him from the rest of us.
Just as in all things, it seems that the answer to the question of whether the Buddha is special is that he is and he isn't.
Indeed. But that is all subject to our own points of view. There are those out there who, due to the unique needs they have to attain Buddhahood, to whom the Buddha presents himself as no more than an insightful man.
Fascinating. One could think of it in terms of skillful means, then. When the listener would better hear the message from a remarkable man, that is how he will appear to them. If they would better understand it as a supernatural gift, he can present it thus.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing secular Buddhism. What is secular Buddhism? What are its origins and principles? What are some of its strengths and weaknesses? We hope you enjoy.
Before we can do that, though, let's step back and define our terms. What does the word secular actually mean?
In order to dive into what secular Buddhism actually is, we need to discuss this word secular. The dictionary definition of secular is, quote, attitudes, activities, or other things that have no religious or spiritual basis, unquote. This seems quite simple on its face, but I have a lot of issues with the term. Here will be a good place to discuss my biases first, though. You may be thinking that my education in religion has led to a bias against the idea of secularity, because all I do is study religion. Additionally, as a self-identifying Buddhist, you may think that I have an issue with the word because I myself am quote-unquote religious. However, I should say that the agenda of my education has never been pro or anti-religion, so I can't count that, my education, among my many biases. Additionally, Buddhism itself has its very own strong trends toward this idea of secularity, as we'll soon discuss, so my being Buddhist doesn't necessarily bias me against secularity either. The issue of secularity is a matter of great debate in scholarly circles, whether they be religion, anthropology, history, philosophy, and so on, and so people outside of scholarly circles might not even realize what a weedy issue they have stumbled upon. One issue with the word secular that I personally think is quite severe is the fact that the term is incredibly vague to the point where it's not very useful for talking about the world around us. For this term to be useful, you have to pick a frame of phenomena within which it can be used, such as social rituals and institutions, academic investigation and debate, political decisions and platforms, or language use and syntax, to name a few examples. If you don't do that and stick to it, then the word can be emptied out of any real meaning and be used as a flag behind which people rally in support of a particular ideology. A real-life example of this is how ultra-conservative Republican Christians in the U.S. use the word secular almost like a dirty word. They argue that their political opponents want to create a secular country and society by means of erasing and persecuting the public practice of Christianity. This serves as a fear-mongering soundbite to bring radical and bigoted Christian people to their political movement, which actually seeks to violate the separation between church and state by legislating religious laws, such as abortion and birth control bans, bans on divorce, restrictions placed on LGBTQ people, and much, much more. In doing this, they proclaim to believe that they have defeated the secular left and protected the freedom of Christianity in the country. But actually, they are acting in bad faith to create a Christian theocracy which compromises the freedom of others to publicly practice their religion if they have one, or the freedom from following the rules of another person's religion if they don't have one.
We can also see it having the same mushy definition from the other side. I suspect a fair number of folks using the term tie it up with rational, logical, and evidence-based. That's not always the case, though. Belief in the Loch Ness Monster is not rational, logical, nor evidence-based, but it's also not overtly religious. I think it's also sometimes used as a flag term for non-Judeo-Christian, which is Eurocentric, as we've discussed already. There are plenty of religions that are not Christianity.
To continue with problems with the word itself, it actually represents something that I think is purely impossible. It envisions the possibility of a phenomenon that exists in a world where religion exists and has existed for many thousands of years, yet is not at all influenced by that existence of religion in the world. Human beings are not capable of fully emptying out their context, their biases, their experience, and that of the majority of people around them, and carry out their lives according to that. In simpler terms, to be motivated against something is still to be motivated by it. Atheists motivated against religion are still being influenced by religion. Some of the most outspoken atheists think about God and the church and such almost as much as Christians themselves do. This does not always take away from the importance and the strength of their arguments, however. I'm not saying that an atheist is wrong for critiquing the Catholic Church for harboring pedophilic priests, or for saying that creationism should be taught in public schools. Both of those are absolutely correct critiques of religion in the United States, in particular. However, evolution is a creation story. It's one whose basis is scientific in nature, but it's still a creation story. And creation stories, in their own way, are kind of religious. They come from an urge that some people might call spiritual or religious, an urge for humanity to understand itself, its origins, and its place in space and time, and so on. This is a prime example of how secular is an impossible ideal. I think it is simply contrary to human nature. I don't think it is a useful descriptor for any of the different methods of knowing things that humans have come up with because it proclaims a perfection or perhaps a sufficiency that no single method of knowing anything has.
I want to push back on that framing a little bit. So, I think the urge to understand ourselves can come from simple curiosity. Our place in the world, where we come from, I don't see that as a necessarily inherently religious thing. That could just be, I wonder. And so, in that case, the spiritual or religious motivation being described here feels like it is being read in by the observer. Or at some point there has to be a case made that curiosity is a religious or spiritual experience in and of itself.
That's a good point to bring up, and it brings up the other side of this issue, which we're not going over in this episode, which is that if secular is a problematic and vague term, so too is religion, right? Deciding what is and isn't secular motivated or religiously motivated is very, very difficult. However, I do think that that curiosity that you're speaking to, because it is shared between people of secular motivations and of religious motivations, however you decide to delineate those two, does mean essentially that the secular motivations deciding that they're not the other ones for some reason, even if they're looking towards the same point, be that point the origin of humanity or the place that we exist in the cosmos, I think that all of that being pointed at the same direction inherently means that the two separate categories can't really be opposites. Furthermore, along these lines of the problems with the word secular, I think it's oxymoronic, reckless, and short-sighted to use secular as a descriptor for a religion, as in the case of secular Buddhism. The word itself refers to attitudes, phenomena, or activities that lack a spiritual or religious basis. Everything in a religion is going to be an attitude, a phenomenon, or an activity that has a religious basis. To think otherwise is to either completely misunderstand or to foolishly or even maliciously misappropriate the religion in question. For example, in Christianity, Jesus preaches the golden rule: treat others the way you would want to be treated. This statement does not say anything about God, heaven, or hell, and so that might lead a secular person to think, yeah, this is a secular moral presented by Jesus. That this moral lacks any religious or spiritual basis. It's true that this moral is applicable outside of the context of Christianity, but that does not make it a secular moral at all. The reason why Jesus says we ought to treat each other the way we would want to be treated is because that is how we avoid sin and hell and how we reach heaven. Therein lies the problem with quote-unquote secular religion. You have to throw out the why behind the principles you uphold in order to call it secular. Throwing out the why is an incredibly reckless and even sometimes malicious practice. This is an exaggerated hypothetical for argumentative purposes that I'm about to say, but imagine if you decided you were going to quit using particular words in your vocabulary. Why should you? Maybe these words are racial slurs, homophobic or transphobic slurs, or they're ableist, sexist, or generally hurtful words, and you want to stop using them. The why behind why one might eliminate them from their vocabulary is that they are harmful to people. However, if you throw out the why, and you completely forget or ignore that there is a whole history of oppression attached to those words, then you're not actually helping solve the problem of systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, or more. Theoretically, it would still be possible to be incredibly racist, homophobic, sexist, ableist, even if you've decided not to use those words, simply because you're ignorant or unaware of the history and meaning and are not motivated to act according to that history and meaning. Sometimes secularists also throw out the what. For example, prayer is a critical ritual in Christianity, but like many other rituals, secular people are willing to throw it out to create their own secular version of the religion in question. This introduces a ship of Theseus problem. If you remove one ritual at a time from a religious tradition to call it a secular religion, at what point is it no longer the religion you started with and is instead something else entirely? If there's no prayer between the practitioner and God, are you really doing Christianity? I doubt it.
So to bring all this back into the context of Buddhism, what is secular Buddhism?
Secular Buddhism is a particular movement that falls under the umbrella of Buddhist modernism, which we've talked about at length in the past. Secular Buddhism has come to be quite popular in the West in the last 60 or so years, and there have been lots of books, articles, podcasts, and other things like that have been published on the subject, some of which I'll link in the show notes. In my understanding, the axiom behind secular Buddhism is twofold. On the one hand, Buddhists are motivated to change and adapt Buddhism to the needs, circumstances, and proclivities of the modern Western world. They assume that the modern Western world is largely interested in something that's not incongruent with science, something that's commodifiable and easily consumed, and something that is not esoteric or difficult to understand. In this pursuit, they remove or change the why behind the moral prescriptions of Buddhism. Take emptiness, for example. Emptiness is a serious, complicated, and specific doctrinal point that fits in a particular place in the Buddhist scheme as a whole. It is the absence of real unchanging existence in anything that arises in the world. However, it gets reimagined and psychologized in Buddhist modernism to essentially say, emptiness means that whatever happens in life is not a big deal, because it's all empty, so I shouldn't be too upset by it at all. They also say that emptiness is not a doctrinal point, but actually a scientific fact. When physicists discovered that most of the atom is composed of empty space, between the nuclei and electrons, Buddhist modernists and secularists claim, well, the Buddha has been saying that for 2,500 years. He said everything was empty when he was still alive, and you've only just now rediscovered that. But that is a dire mistranslation or misunderstanding at work. Emptiness does not refer to the literal empty space between atoms. Secular Buddhists only jumped on the chance to align their doctrine with science to afford their doctrine more credibility in a world which has become increasingly concerned with evidence-based justifications for things rather than text or faith-based justifications for things. On the other hand, secular Buddhism is fueled on by Western people who find themselves opposed to or disenchanted with Judeo-Christian religions for many valid reasons. They rightly look at all the problems with organized Western religion, and they remove themselves from that context. I did the same thing. Docs did the same thing.
Yep.
That's totally fine. However, many secular Buddhist people who got started this way take another step of thinking X, Y, and Z are the problems of the religions I have had experience with. Therefore, they must also be the problems with all religions anywhere, even the ones I don't know about. This is a huge mistake. I'm not here to say that there are no problems and abuses in Buddhism. There are tons of them, and we've covered them in the past and will continue to cover them. What I'm saying is that the particular reasons that a Western person would be inclined to leave Christianity might not be necessarily shared between Christianity and Buddhism. Buddhism is not anti-LGBTQ. Buddhism is not a colonizer religion. Buddhism does not rely on blind faith in an intangible God. Thinking all religions have X, Y, and Z problems is a close-minded perspective lacking nuance. I think that secular Buddhists know this on some level because they're willing to label themselves as Buddhists, even if they are Buddhists of the secular type. So secular Buddhists who started out as disenchanted Westerners have, for the most part, been sold something that is commodifiable and caters to their disenchantment with Judeo-Christian religions, as well as their inclinations to believe in science, and their inclinations to have a materialist view of the world rather than a faith-based view of the world. To be clear, if it works for them, that's good. I don't fault anybody for their justifications for being a good person, if they're being a good person, and I never will. I don't care what people think the origin of the universe or the nature of reality is, as long as they're being a good person. I'm simply here to say, this is water. When I say this is water, I'm referring to a commencement speech given by David Foster Wallace at Kenyon College that addressed those forces in our lives and the histories of those forces that affect us every single day, but we might not have any knowledge of them. I'll link it in the show notes.
What are some of the strengths and weaknesses of secular Buddhism?
Let's start with the strengths, because we've been really ripping into secular Buddhism for the whole episode so far. To start with, secular Buddhism is very humanistic, and, in fact, is closely related to secular humanism, meaning the basic tenets and principles are very good. Secular Buddhism rejects the power imbalances that lead to tension and abuse at every scale. That is, they're anti-racist, anti-sexist, pro-LGBTQ, feminist, pro-working class, pro-environment, pro-animal rights and welfare, and more. Shrunken down to a smaller scale, they also reject the power imbalances in Buddhist ecumenical structures that lead to possible master-student abuse. This is in part due to the motivations of the movement's leaders seeking to reform the religion and work to quash the abuses and tribalism and power imbalances that can arise in Buddhist monastic cultures. Additionally, they very strongly value loving kindness, compassion, abstaining from abusive speech, and things like that. Next, secular Buddhism highly values meditation practice. Even if they don't do it with expressly Buddhist religious motivations, meditation has countless mental and physical health benefits, many of which are backed up by scientific research. These include lowering blood pressure, lowering cortisol and adrenaline levels in the blood, both of which are stress hormones that can overwork or damage one's internal organs with constant exposure, reducing anxiety and depression, and more. It can also increase feelings of sympathy, compassion, empathy, and respect for others' dignity. Furthermore, meditation just helps a person feel centered and balanced with who they are in the world. It can help people work through traumas, fears, anxieties, griefs, and more. It's very, very practically useful, and I think that there are a large number of people who would even identify with a religious tradition other than Buddhism who would agree with that and who would practice meditation regularly. Finally, one of the biggest strengths is that secular Buddhism is very aware of the cultural contexts in which the Buddhist texts have come to be. This is what leads to the feminist, pro-LGBTQ, and pro-environmentalist views we mentioned before. They can take the good stuff, like non-duality, when it comes to issues of gender and sexuality, and they can throw away the bad stuff, like this doctrine that women can't become Buddhas in the woman's body. This is informed by a scholarly perspective towards Buddhist teachings, which I'm always in favor of. Now let's discuss some of the weaknesses. The biggest one I can think of is that secular Buddhism is very quick to write off the cosmology and many of the doctrines in Buddhism as being flatly superstitious. Superstition is regarded as being in opposition to evidence-based thinking and rationalist thinking. The idea is that superstition is fearful unknowing that governs seemingly pointless behaviors for the sake of taking one's best chances against that unknowing. While on the other hand, rational and evidential thinking, as they claim it, causes somebody to act only on what they can verify with their senses. This is incredibly condescending. This superstition term is used a lot whenever there's been colonial relationships between the West and the East, which have existed in a power imbalance of some kind. And whenever people have been quick to look at rituals that did not exist in a Judeo-Christian context and write them off as being superstitious, because they just simply couldn't understand what they were about, and they thought it was lesser anyways because they were European people, and they were the capital O other, and they were not doing Christianity or any other kind of Judeo-Christian religion to begin with. What gets written off in the Buddhist context as superstitious is the doctrine of karma, rebirth, the existence of devas, asuras, hungry ghosts, and hell dwellers, and any rituals or practices related to these creatures or doctrines which are intangible and can't be viewed with the senses. Frankly, calling all that stuff superstitious, as I said, is very condescending and insulting to the people who practice those things and who create and participate that religious structure. It prioritizes Western values and experiences far over any others, and thus is very Eurocentric. Additionally, it belittles and condescends people in the past or present who identify as Buddhists and who live in that ecosystem of ideas. It implies people from non-white countries are uncivilized and uneducated and are thus superstitious, while people from predominantly white countries are the smartest and the most correct and the most rational and the most evidence-based in all their behaviors. It's deeply rooted in 19th century colonial thinking, which is extremely harmful and should not be deployed anymore in the modern era. One other point that is connected to all of this is that secular Buddhism prioritizes this idea of belief to a cartoonish scale when actual Buddhism does not really prioritize it as much as they do. The reason why this is prioritized so strongly in secular Buddhism is that the Westerners who create and develop and participate in it are too deeply steeped in modern-era Judeo-Christian ideas to see out of them, especially in the context of belief. They think that belief in these superstitious things is a choice, and therefore a willful rejection of the evidence in front of everyone's faces, and is thus misguided and stupid and inferior. Their thinking is that they see 2,000 years of atrocities committed in the name of belief in a Christian God which nobody can see, smell, taste, touch, or hear, and thus must be made up. They think of choosing to believe in that as foolish and ignorant and problematic. However, this idea of belief as being a choice and being a willful rejection of that evidence which is in front of our faces is very short-sighted, very Christian-centric, and again, very Eurocentric. Buddhists in East Asia, for the most part, don't reject evolution, don't reject the Big Bang, or vaccines, or anything like that. Similarly, people in the past were not lesser because of having all of that cosmology. Thinking so is again condescending and ignorant of culture and history. It imagines that people in the past were not as smart as us, and that the relative intelligence of humanity goes ever upwards over time and is higher now than it ever has been. That again prioritizes the present and belittles people in the past. In fact, people approaching the world 1,000 years ago approached it with the exact same or similar brain capacity and intellect as we do today. It's just that their values, their cultural capital, their experiences, and their goals and agendas were different from ours. People in the West believe in ghosts and aliens in the absence of tangible and conclusive evidence sometimes, and I don't see in any way how that's any different than belief in hungry ghosts or reincarnation. The next weakness is that secular Buddhism is largely ignorant of non-secular Buddhism, the history of Buddhism in the modern era, or even secular Buddhism's own history. I mentioned a minute ago that this is the water, referring to how secular Buddhists have been sold something that was modified, commodified, and packaged up for them. This is the result of a long and complicated history containing many colonial relationships and changes in prevailing ways of thinking and approaching the world. They also haven't really thought much about the issues I brought up with the word secular. Most secular Buddhists, especially the leaders of the movement, don't know most of that. I say this even though I don't know many secular Buddhists myself, because if they knew about the water, they probably would not be so quick to identify themselves as secular Buddhists. Seeing how colonial, condescending, belittling, and problematic this movement's core principles are, they probably wouldn't want to be very close to any of this. This leads us to the next weakness. Those principles which it claims to adopt from Buddhism are not actually Buddhist in some cases. When you Google secular Buddhism and its core tenets, you get this thing called the Fourfold Tasks. These 4 tasks are to embrace life, let reactivity be, let reactivity pass, and actualize a path. Why do I have a problem with this? Because it is supposed to be a presentation of the 4 Noble Truths, rewritten for their own purposes, They read the truth of the existence of dukkha and interpret it to say, embrace life. That arguably is the opposite of what the message of the First Noble Truth is. Secondly, they conflate the issue of reactivity with the second truth, that the cause of dukkha is desire, and the third truth, the existence of the cessation of dukkha. Reactivity is a psychological concept which essentially points to changing one's thinking and belief habits. It's about knowing how you react to stuff and then changing that reaction when it's unhealthy for you. Again, as a way of living life, that's all fine, but it's not the second and third noble truths from Buddhism by a long shot. Finally, the fourth noble truth of nirvana being the end of dukkha, being reimagined as actualizing a path, sounds like something from The Secret. It basically says take whatever self-motivated and self-oriented goal you have and just make it happen. That's not the fourth noble truth at all, nor is it very Buddhist.
Quick post-recording addendum. Since recording this episode, we've encountered an additional source that expounds upon this process of actualizing a path. We still have many criticisms of the idea, but there's more to it than we originally understood. We'll expound on this in a future episode.
I want to reiterate that I'm not judging these principles on their value as ways of living one's life. What I will be judging them on is whether or not they're congruent with the actual Buddhist texts. People can live however they want as long as they are nice to other people. I'm just here to mention what is and what is not agreeable with the texts. Thus, buyer beware of this secular Buddhist stuff. Again, I don't want to cast aspersions on people who are living their lives the best way they know how, but I do want to highlight the history, the context, and the discrepancies that are involved. Being an informed consumer is critically important to being an ethical consumer, if such a thing is possible.
Earlier, we discussed removing words from one's vocabulary. Another reason to do so is if the word isn't useful for conveying meaning, and I've become convinced that secular falls into that category. It bundles up too many ideas and has inconsistent meaning from person to person. There are probably better words to choose if I'm trying to say something that I would otherwise have called secular in the past. There's just better words for it.
I agree completely.
This is already a long episode for us, and we actually had more that we wanted to say, so we're not quite done talking about secular Buddhism. There will be more on this subject in a little while. However, next week we're going to diverge into something else. So, Nick, if you would like to talk about it?
Yes, thank you. We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of secular Buddhism. Next week, we'll be discussing Buddhism's entry into Korea. What is the story of Buddhism's entry into Korea? How did this affect Korean shamanism? How did this influence Korean Buddhism going forward? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this is Med Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.